Prepare for a leisurely and captivating journey into the world of ancient Greek legends and their timeless tales. These stories, like a gentle whisper, have been passed down through millennia, echoing in the marble halls of time from one generation to the next. Let the ambient light soften, and may all who are ready to listen settle in comfortably, allowing the day's hustle to dissipate, like the morning mist melting over the azure waters of the Aegean Sea. Simply dim the lights, perhaps turn on a barely audible fan for a soft background hum, and then we can begin this wondrous voyage into a land where majestic gods walked freely among mere mortals, and every story told held a kernel of truth, skillfully disguised beneath a veil of marvel. On the picturesque hills of ancient Sicily, where endless meadows stretched out like a magnificent tapestry woven from wild flowers, a living dream of a great artist, lived a young maiden named Persephone. Her days were filled with an activity that, to an outsider, might have seemed surprisingly ordinary. She gathered flowers, but not with the haste one might pluck a simple dandelion from their yard. No, Persephone glided through these meadows like a gentle breeze, her bare feet barely disturbing the crystal surface of the morning dew. She gracefully knelt beside lush clusters of narcissus, whose pristine white petals softly caught the first rays of the rising sun, and with incredible care she selected only the most perfect specimens. Her intricately woven basket gradually grew heavy with delicate hyacinths, fragrant roses, and humble violets, which seemed to radiate their own inner light. The air was almost palpably sweet, like nectar, a unique blend of honey and freshly cut grass, the scent of a true spring morning, when everything is renewed and seems full of boundless possibilities. Persephone's mother, the great Demeter, was revered as the goddess of harvest and fertility, and through their combined efforts the world flourished, brimming with life. It was an existence imbued with deep tranquility, as predictable and unchanging as the regular change of seasons. It offered solace, was reliable, and absolutely safe. But on that fateful morning, as Persephone, engrossed in her innocent passion, wandered a little further from her usual paths, her attention was suddenly drawn to something extraordinary. In a small, secluded clearing grew a solitary narcissus flower, striking in its beauty and grandeur. It was larger and more exquisite than any she had ever encountered. Its petals seemed to shimmer like precious pearls, and its enchanting fragrance beckoned her. Forward with such irresistible force, as if an invisible voice called her name. What Persephone did not know, nor could have even imagined, was that this flower had not been placed there by chance. It had been planted deliberately, deep beneath the earth, in caves so bottomless that sunlight never penetrated their gloomy vaults. There, below, ruled Hades, the silent lord of the realm of the dead. He was not the malevolent tyrant he is sometimes mistakenly portrayed as in ancient tales. He was merely profoundly lonely. One can only imagine what it means to spend an eternity in a place where nothing grows, nothing changes, nothing lives. Such silence must have been deafening in its absolute completeness. Hades had observed Persephone during his rare and fleeting visits to the upper world, noticing her gentle care for the flowers, and something in his ancient, cold heart stirred. But how could the Lord of the Dead hope to win the daughter of fertility? How was it possible to bridge the gaping chasm between life and death, between shining sunlight and eternal shadow? At the very moment Persephone bent down to pluck this extraordinary narcissus, the earth beneath her feet suddenly trembled. At first it was just a faint tremor, a soft rumble, like distant thunder or the sound of a carriage passing far away. But then, with a deafening sound, like the creak of a giant door on ancient rusted hinges, the earth gaped open, and from its bottomless depths a majestic chariot swiftly ascended. It was drawn by 4 black horses whose eyes glowed like ominous stars in the night. Hades himself, cloaked in his dark, flowing mantle, gripped the reins tightly. With one swift and decisive motion he lifted the stunned Persephone into his chariot, and before she could utter a single cry, they were already speeding back into the gloomy depths of the underworld. The opening in the earth instantly closed behind them, as if it had never existed. The only silent evidence of what had happened were Persephone's scattered flowers on the grass and her overturned wicker basket lying among the greenery. When Demeter, seized by a premonition of disaster, discovered her daughter's disappearance, her grief descended upon the world with a force it had never before experienced. Just as profound sorrow can paralyze a person, depriving them of all desire to act, eat, or care for familiar things, so too did Demeter sink into despair. But her inaction had truly cosmic consequences. She completely ceased her divine duties of tending to the crops. The rain stopped watering the earth. She no longer coaxed the seeds to awaken and sprout in spring. The world around began to rapidly plunge into cold and barrenness. Leaves on trees yellowed and fell, but no new ones appeared. Grass withered and dried. Flowers perished. Even the olive trees, sacred to the gods and once full of life, shed their fruit long before they could ripen, portending impending famine and destruction. Meanwhile, deep within the underworld, entirely unexpected events were unfolding. Persephone, having overcome her initial shock and profound fear, gradually began to notice details in her new abode that could not but surprise her. The walls of Hades' majestic palace were intricately inlaid with myriads of precious stones that caught and reflected the meagre light in such a way that they reminded her of distant stars in the night sky. Underground rivers flowed, emitting their own mysterious music, and in gardens where the soil was incredibly rich with minerals from the very heart of the earth, grew astonishing, never-before-seen flowers of unearthly beauty. Hades himself turned out to be not the monster she might have expected. He spoke softly, almost shyly, and in his eyes there was an ancient sadness. He brought her exquisite dishes and fruits she had never tasted before, for they grew only in the deepest parts of the earth, possessing extraordinary sweetness and a unique flavor. He showed her the boundless fields of asphodel, where the souls of ordinary mortals wandered in peaceful, serene dreams. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything of her, only silently hoped that she could understand the true reason he had brought her there. And yet, despite all this, Persephone desperately longed for the sunlight. She missed her mother, the feel of warm earth beneath her bare feet, and the joyful singing of birds in the mornings. However beautiful and wondrous the underworld might be, it was not her home. On the surface of the earth, a true catastrophe was brewing, and the situation was becoming truly desperate. Without Demeter's life-giving care, people began to suffer from unbearable hunger. Other powerful gods, observing the world's decay, implored her to restore the fertility of the land, but she was unyielding. "Return my daughter to me," she firmly replied, "and then the world will flourish again, but not before." Zeus, the almighty king of the gods, finally had to intervene in this all-encompassing tragedy. He sent Hermes, the swift messenger god, to the gloomy realm of Hades to act as a negotiator. Hermes found Hades quietly sitting in his underground garden with Persephone. Neither spoke a word. They simply remained in that strange, timeless state of deep contemplation in which people often find themselves when trying to comprehend something extremely complex. "She must return to the surface," Hermes said softly but insistently to Hades. "The world above is dying." Hades slowly nodded, his gaze filled with ancient sorrow. He knew this moment was inevitable, but then looked at Persephone with eyes that reflected all the bottomless grief of the earth's depths. "I understand," he replied. "But ask her, has she tasted anything while she was here?" This was a question of paramount importance, for there was an ancient, unbreakable law. Anyone who partook of food in the underworld would forever be bound to it. Persephone looked down at her hands. That morning, walking through Hades' exotic garden, she had seen a pomegranate tree laden with fruit. These pomegranates were unlike any she had ever seen. They were dark red, like precious gems, and each seed inside gleamed like a tiny, exquisite jewel. Almost without thinking, she picked one fruit and ate 7 of its seeds. They tasted like concentrated sweetness, like the quintessence of all fruits ever grown on earth. 7 seeds, such an insignificant detail, yet capable of changing the fate of the entire world. Because of these 7 seeds, Persephone could not return to the upper world forever. But Hermes, known for his sharp mind and diplomatic skill, managed to work out an ingenious compromise. For part of each year, 1 month for each seed she had eaten, Persephone would spend with Hades in the underworld. For the remaining months, she would return to her mother and to the world of sunlight and abundant growth. And so it was finally decided, putting an end to immeasurable suffering. When Persephone finally returned to the surface, Demeter's joy was so immense that everywhere her daughter's feet touched, flowers instantly bloomed, filling the world with vibrant colors and fragrances. Spring awoke, like infectious laughter, and was followed by a bountiful summer, bringing an abundance of growth and life-giving warmth. However, when it was time for Persephone to return to the gloomy underworld, Demeter's grief brought with it autumn, painting the leaves crimson and gold, causing them to fall, and then winter, when the whole world plunged into silent repose beneath blankets of snow. It is said that in the underworld, Persephone became a full-fledged and wise queen. She learned to help Hades justly preside over the souls of the dead. She tended to the exotic underground gardens where plants unseen by any living human bloomed. And gradually she developed a deep affection for this quiet, thoughtful god, who had so dramatically changed her life, yet treated her with such tender respect. When spring returned each year, Persephone emerged from the earth, like the flowers themselves, bringing with her the memory of depths and darkness, which made the sunlight even more precious and longed for. And Demeter welcomed her daughter home with such jubilant joy that the whole world celebrated, bursting into bloom with trees, filling with bird song, and the sweet scent of fresh grass. Even now, thousands of years later, one can clearly observe this ancient drama playing out in the cyclical change of seasons. Every autumn, as the leaves begin to change color, Persephone prepares for her return to her underground kingdom. Every winter, the bare branches of trees and dormant seeds like Demeter patiently await the return of spring, and when the first delicate crocus pushes through the snow, it is as if Persephone herself is returning home, heralding new life. This makes one wonder, what other ancient stories might be hidden in the everyday rhythms of the world around us? What mysterious narratives do the seasons themselves whisper to us? Speaking of secrets hidden in everyday expressions, many have likely heard someone described as having an Achilles heel. This idiom is used to denote a small but critical weakness in someone who otherwise seems extraordinarily strong or talented. The story behind these words begins with boundless maternal love and a desperate attempt to protect a child from a fate his mother could not even imagine. Thetis was a beautiful and wise sea goddess, whose hair flowed like ocean waves and whose eyes reflected the bottomless depths of underwater caves. Having married the mortal king Peleus and given birth to a son, she loved this child with all the fierce, instinctive protectiveness that mothers have displayed throughout human history. But being a goddess, Thetis possessed the gift of seeing glimpses of the future, and what she saw filled her heart with unbearable dread. Her son, named Achilles, was destined to become the greatest warrior ever to walk the earth. He would be swift as a gust of wind, strong as a destructive storm, and skilled with sword and spear, surpassing any mortal. Poets would sing of his countless exploits for thousands of years, but despite all this greatness, he would die young, struck down in battle, still in the prime of his youth. Thetis, the sea goddess, gazed tenderly at her small son, feeling his tiny fingers curl around hers. She watched him sleep peacefully, with that perfect serenity only infants possess. How could she, a mother, accept the thought that this precious child was destined for such a short and violent life? It was unthinkable. Her maternal heart demanded action, an attempt to alter fate. And so one night, when the palace was deep in slumber, and even the usually talkative owls were silent, Thetis carefully wrapped her baby in soft blankets and carried him to the banks of the river Styx. This was no ordinary river. It served as the boundary separating the world of the living from the realm of the dead. Its waters possessed extraordinary power. Anyone bathed in them would become invulnerable, protected from all harm. The river was black as midnight itself, and surprisingly warm. It flowed silently like a stream of liquid quiet, enveloping everything. Thetis waded into the water until it reached her waist. Then, holding her breath and whispering prayers to all gods who might hear her plea, she submerged her son in these magical waters. But when holding an infant, it's crucial to hold them firmly so they don't slip from your grasp. Thetis held Achilles by his heel, her fingers securely wrapped around his tiny ankle. The waters of the Styx covered every part of the child's body, except for that small area where his mother's hand shielded him from the river's touch. When she lifted him out, infant Achilles was no longer entirely mortal. His skin had become like strong armor, capable of deflecting any weapon. No sword could cut him, no arrow could pierce him, no spear could wound him. Thetis believed she had succeeded in protecting her son, or at least so she thought at that moment. Achilles grew up exactly as the ancient prophecies foretold. He was tall and strong, with golden hair that caught the sunlight like wheat fields in midsummer. His speed in running surpassed horses. His endurance in battle was incomparable, and his mastery of weapons resembled a deadly yet graceful poetry. When he moved across the battlefield, enemies scattered before him like autumn leaves before an unstoppable hurricane. Yet he was not merely a fierce warrior. He showed kindness to those weaker than himself, was immensely loyal to his friends, and possessed a surprising gentleness for such a formidable fighter. He played the lyre beautifully, composing songs about heroes of old. He cared deeply for his comrades and was not ashamed to weep openly when any of them were wounded or died. In another world he might have been remembered as much for his compassion as for his valor in battle. When the Trojan War erupted, a conflict destined to last 10 long years, all the greatest warriors of Greece sailed across the wine-dark sea to fight. Achilles joined them, leading his contingent of warriors known as the Myrmidons. Their loyalty to him stemmed not only from his invincibility in combat, but also from the genuine respect he showed them and his willingness to share all their hardships. For 9 years, Achilles was exactly what one would expect from an invulnerable warrior. He fought battle after battle, always emerging unscathed, while enemies fell around him like wheat before a scythe. His reputation grew until the mere mention of his name was enough to make enemy armies falter. But then an event occurred that revealed another side of Achilles, the part of him that felt deeply. His closest friend, Patroclus, was killed in battle by Hector, Troy's greatest warrior. Patroclus was more than a friend. He was like a brother to Achilles, someone who understood his heart beneath all that invulnerable skin. Achilles' grief was like a natural disaster. He wept so loudly that his mother heard him from her underwater palace. He refused to eat or sleep. He cut off his beautiful golden hair and cast it onto Patroclus's funeral pyre. And then, driven by a rage that was truly twisted love, he hunted down Hector and challenged him to a duel. The battle between Achilles and Hector was like a storm clashing with a mountain. Both were immensely skilled. Both possessed undeniable courage, but only one was protected by the waters of the Styx. Hector fought valiantly, but in the end, Achilles' spear found its mark, and Troy's greatest defender fell. What Achilles did next revealed both his human heart and his terrible grief. Instead of treating Hector's body with the respect due a worthy foe, he lashed it to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy. It was an act of desecration that shocked both armies and angered the gods themselves. For several days Achilles continued this grim ritual, driving his chariot around the walls of Troy, as Hector's family watched in horror from the city's ramparts. It seemed that by punishing Hector's body, he could somehow punish death itself for taking his friend. But eventually, Hector's father, old King Priam, did something that required more courage than any charge on the battlefield. He came alone to Achilles' tent in the middle of the night, unarmed and unguarded, to beg for his son's body. The old man knelt before the warrior who had killed his child and spoke not as a king to an enemy, but as a father to another man who understood loss. "I have done what no mortal has done," Priam said softly. "I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son." Something in those words broke through Achilles' rage and grief to touch his heart. He looked at this elderly man bent with sorrow and saw his own father, who would one day mourn him in the same way. He wept then, not angry tears of fury, but cleansing tears of shared human pain. He returned Hector's body to Priam and declared a truce so that Troy could properly mourn its hero. It was one of Achilles' finest moments, showing that even the greatest warrior was, in the end, merely a man who could be moved by compassion. But the war continued, and fate had not forgotten its claim on Achilles. In the final battles before the walls of Troy, as he fought with his characteristic agility and fearlessness, an arrow flew towards him. It was shot by Paris, Hector's brother, who was known more for his beauty than his bravery. Normally, such an arrow would have harmlessly bounced off Achilles' protected skin. But this arrow, guided by the god Apollo, found the single vulnerable spot on Achilles' entire body, his heel, the very place where his mother's fingers had shielded him from the waters of the Styx. It was such a small target, such an unlikely wound, but it was enough. The greatest warrior who ever lived fell because of his heel, the one place where his mother's protective touch had left him mortal. In trying to save her son from his destiny, Thetis had unintentionally created the very weakness that would destroy him. Dying, Achilles did not think of his many victories or his eternal glory, but of simple things, the feel of sunlight on his face, the laughter of his friend Patroclus, the songs he would never finish composing. He thought of his mother and hoped she would understand that he had tried to live a life that honored the life she had given him, even if he could not extend it as long as she wished. The story of Achilles reminds us that our greatest strengths and our deepest weaknesses often spring from the same source, the love of those who care for us. Every protection has its limits. Every gift has its price. And sometimes what makes us strong also makes us vulnerable. Even now, when we speak of someone's Achilles heel, we recall this ancient truth. Everyone, no matter how powerful they seem, has that small place where the arrows of fate can strike them. Perhaps it is not a weakness, but simply a part of what makes us human. The arrows of fate that struck Achilles were not the only ones that forever changed history. Sometimes love itself can be the most dangerous arrow of all. As a young musician named Orpheus discovered on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Orpheus possessed a gift that transcended ordinary talent. When he played his lyre and sang, flowers bloomed out of season. Rivers changed their courses to flow closer to his music. Wild animals sat peacefully side by side. Lions next to lambs, hawks next to mice. All listened with the same dreamy contentment one feels when someone hums a beloved lullaby. Even trees uprooted themselves and moved closer to hear him play. Imagine the scene. You walk through a forest and see ancient oaks slowly shifting, like enormous gentle giants, their leaves rustling in time with a distant melody. Such was the power of Orpheus's music. It made the impossible natural, the magical commonplace. When Orpheus fell in love with Eurydice, a wood nymph with eyes like spring water and a laugh like the chime of the wind, his songs seemed to grow even more beautiful. He composed melodies that captured how sunlight tangled in her dark hair, rhythms that matched her graceful movement through the meadows, harmonies that expressed all the wonder he felt simply watching her tend to injured birds or gather wild honey. Their wedding day was perfect in a way that makes one believe in the fundamental goodness of the world. The ceremony took place in a grove where wild flowers grew in natural circles, as if the earth itself had decided to celebrate. Orpheus sang a song he had written especially for the occasion, and as his voice rose and fell, butterflies danced around the couple like living confetti. After the ceremony, as the sun began to set and the celebration transitioned into that peaceful weariness that follows a perfect day, Eurydice went for a walk in the meadow. She wanted a few moments alone to soak in the happiness. to let it settle into her heart like honey in warm bread. She walked barefoot through the grass, still wearing her wedding wreath of wild roses, when she stepped on something that stirred beneath her foot. A snake, disturbed in its evening rest, bit her ankle with fangs carrying deadly venom. Eurydice only had time to call Orpheus's name before she collapsed among the flowers that had celebrated her happiness just moments before. By the time Orpheus reached her, she was gone. Her hand was still warm in his, her face still peaceful, but everything that made her Eurydice, her laughter, her gentle teasing, her way of humming when he played, all of it had vanished like the morning mist. For 7 days and 7 nights Orpheus remained by Eurydice's body, pouring out his sorrow in songs so poignant that, legend has it, even the silent stones shed tears. His music had always held astonishing power over all things in the natural world, but now it expressed such genuine and profound pain that it seemed the very fabric of existence was tearing under its onslaught. The grieving onlookers implored him to eat, to sleep, to at least briefly distract himself from his sorrow and care for himself. But Orpheus was incapable. How could one partake of food when the person who filled life with meaning and taste had vanished? How could one find peace in sleep when dreams were permeated with melodies he would never again be able to share? Finally, a thought struck him. A thought so desperate and risky that only a madman consumed by grief would dare attempt it. He decided to descend into the underworld itself and persuade Hades to return Eurydice. Until then, no mortal had dared. To enter the realm of the dead and return. But Orpheus had his gift, music. And music had always been known for its ability to accomplish the impossible. The entrance to the underworld was hidden deep within a cave where the sun's rays never penetrated, never reaching its farthest corners. As Orpheus descended, playing his lyre whose sounds seemed to light his way, the usual noises of the netherworld gradually fell silent. The tormented groans of the damned, the rumble of the Styx, the creak of massive gates, all hushed to listen to his song. Even Cerberus, the 3-headed guardian of the gates of the dead, lay down and whimpered softly as Orpheus played. The monster's 3 pairs of eyes, usually burning with eternal vigilance, closed, like those of a sleeping puppy. When Orpheus finally stood before the thrones of Hades and Persephone, he performed the most important song of his life. He sang of love that transcends death itself, of the unbearable pain of separation, of a world that had lost its music when Eurydice was taken from him. His song was so beautiful, so filled with genuine grief and all-consuming love, that for the first time in countless millennia, Hades shed tears. Even the Furies, those fearsome goddesses of vengeance whose hearts were believed to be harder than stone, found their cheeks wet with tears they couldn't remember ever shedding. Persephone, who understood better than anyone what it meant to be torn from the upper world, leaned over and whispered something in her husband's ear. Hades slowly nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, like any mortal overwhelmed by strong emotions. "Your music has touched our hearts," Hades said, and in his voice was an unexpected tenderness and compassion. "We will return Eurydice to you, but there is one condition. You must exit the underworld ahead of her, and you must not look back until both of you are under the sunlight of the upper world. If you turn to look at her even once before that moment, she will be lost to you forever, This condition seemed simple enough. Orpheus had found his way into the underworld. Surely he could find his way back out. He readily nodded, already anticipating the moment when he and Eurydice would step into daylight and begin their life together anew. The journey back began with an indescribable sense of joy. Behind him, Orpheus heard Eurydice's familiar footsteps, her light breath, the rustle of her wedding dress against the stones. Sometimes she softly hummed the melodies he played, lighting their way, and that sound was sweeter than any music he had ever heard. However, as they ascended higher and the path grew steeper, unsettling doubts began to creep into Orpheus's mind. The footsteps behind him seemed so faint. What if he was only imagining them? What if Hades had tricked him, and he was ascending alone while Eurydice remained trapped below? What if she was struggling to keep up? Growing tired, slowing down. The closer they got to the surface, the more these fears consumed him. He began to walk more slowly, straining to hear any sign of her presence. Once, when the path was particularly difficult, he heard her stumble slightly, and he had to grip his lyre tightly to keep from turning to help her. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours of climbing, Orpheus saw something that made his heart leap with jubilation. Ahead, a thin strip of sunlight appeared, marking the entrance to the cave. They were almost free. Just a few more steps, and both of them would be back in the world of the living. But as he approached this strip of light, the doubts that had plagued him reached their peak. The footsteps behind him had become so faint he could barely hear them. What if Eurydice was still trapped in the dark realm behind them? What if she needed his help to cross this final threshold? At the very moment his own feet touched the sunlight, just one step before Eurydice would have been safe, Orpheus turned around. For one perfect, heartbreaking instant, he saw her. She was there, as beautiful as ever, reaching for the light and for him. But she was still one step inside the boundary of the underworld, and by looking back, Orpheus had broken the condition of her release. "Farewell, my love," Eurydice whispered, and her voice was full of sadness, but not anger. She understood that he had turned back out of love for her, not doubt. But understanding could not change the consequences. She vanished like the morning mist, and this time there was no body to mourn, no grave to visit. She simply dissolved, returning to the realm of the dead, and the path behind Orpheus closed like water over a stone. For the rest of his life, Orpheus dedicated himself to composing songs of love and loss, of that terrible space between hope and despair. His music became more beautiful than ever before, but also immeasurably sadder, carrying the knowledge that some mistakes cannot be undone, and some chances cannot be repeated. He never again attempted to return to the underworld. Perhaps he realized that Hades' mercy could not be sought twice, or perhaps he understood that some sorrows must simply be carried, transformed into something else through the alchemy of time and acceptance. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice serves as a reminder that love sometimes asks us to do impossible things, to move forward without looking back, to believe in what we cannot see, to trust promises that seem too good to be true. And sometimes, even when we fail at these impossible tasks, the attempt itself becomes a kind of music that echoes through the world long after we are gone. Sometimes echoes of ancient stories seep into our modern lives in the most unpredictable ways. Just as Orpheus's music lived on after he was gone, so too has the whisper of a magnificent city, believed to have vanished beneath the ocean waves long before recorded history, persisted to this day. The philosopher Plato first brought the story of Atlantis to the world in his famous writings, describing it as a place that existed 9,000 years before his own time. Whether it was historical fact or a kind of thought experiment about the rise and fall of great civilizations, we may never know for certain. However, the story he told was so vivid and incredibly detailed that people have been searching for Atlantis ever since. According to Plato, Atlantis was located on a vast island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar. This island was larger than Libya and Asia combined. It was arranged in a series of concentric circles, where rings of land alternated with channels of water, resembling a grand target made of earth and sea. At the very center of these circles rose a city whose beauty surpassed all imagination. Buildings were constructed from black, white, and red stone, quarried on the island itself, and many were adorned with brass, tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which emitted a warm, golden glow. The palace, situated in the heart of the city, was a true marvel of engineering and architectural art. Its walls were covered in silver, and its pinnacles shone with gold. Inside lay a majestic temple to Poseidon, god of the sea, who, legend had it, was the progenitor of Atlantis's first king. The exterior of the temple was completely covered in silver, except for the pinnacles that gleamed with gold, and inside stood a massive statue of Poseidon, driving 6 winged horses, so tall that his head almost touched the ceiling of the enormous hall. Yet, perhaps more impressive than the city's outward beauty, was its incredible sophistication. The Atlanteans had created an intricate system of hot and cold springs that supplied water to luxurious baths. They built harbours capable of accommodating ships from all the known world. They had developed agriculture to such an extent that their fertile island yielded 2 harvests a year. The people of Atlantis traced their lineage back to Poseidon himself, and for many generations they retained something of their divine nature. They were known for their wisdom, justice, and moderation in desires. They valued virtue above wealth, and wisdom above power. Their laws were carved on pillars of orichalcum, and kings met alternately every 5 and 6 years to discuss affairs of state, and ensure the triumph of justice throughout their vast kingdom. For countless generations, Atlantis flourished under this system. Their ships sailed distant seas, bringing back knowledge and diverse goods, and sharing their own innovations. They were skilled in sciences that other civilizations had not yet even conceived of. The Atlanteans understood the movement of celestial bodies, the properties of metals, and methods for cultivating plants in conditions that other peoples would have deemed impossible. But over time, something subtly began to change in the very nature of the Atlanteans. The divine spark, their heritage from Poseidon, dimmed with each new generation, weakened by intermarriage with mortals and perhaps by the corrupting influence of excessive ease and prosperity. Where once they were content with sufficiency, they began to crave excess. Where once they valued wisdom, they began to value cunning. Where once they were generous to strangers and neighbors, they became greedy and territorial. This transformation was gradual, like a slow sunset, so imperceptible that one might not notice it until suddenly realizing that the light around has completely changed. The Atlanteans began to look beyond their abundant island, seeing not potential friends and trading partners, but only territories to conquer and peoples to subdue. They amassed a colossal military force and set out to conquer the Mediterranean. Their advanced technology and impeccably coordinated tactics made them virtually invincible. One after another, ancient cities and kingdoms fell before their irresistible onslaught. However, when they reached Athens, a city that would one day be Plato's home, they encountered unexpected and fierce resistance. The ancient Athenians, though vastly outnumbered and technologically inferior, fought with the desperation of people defending their homes and the righteousness of those who refused to submit to tyranny. Against all odds, Athens not only repelled the Atlantean invasion, but launched a counterattack that drove the would-be conquerors back across the sea. It seemed that the courage and virtue that the Atlanteans had lost had somehow taken root in Athenian soil. But the true judgment upon Atlantis came not from human enemies, but from the gods themselves. Zeus, observing from Mount Olympus, saw what the once noble Atlanteans had become, greedy, aggressive, corrupt, and decided that such a civilization had forfeited its right to exist. The end came in one day and one night. Earthquakes shook the island with such furious force that buildings crumbled like card houses. Volcanic eruptions filled the air with ash and fire. But most destructive of all was that the sea itself rose and swallowed the land. The concentric circles which had been Atlantis's glory turned into gigantic whirlpools that dragged ships, buildings, and people into the abyss. The great palace, the temple of Poseidon, the libraries full of accumulated wisdom, the harbours that welcomed ships from all over the world, all disappeared beneath the encroaching waves that closed over the island like a shutting book. When morning came, nothing remained but the boundless ocean. The sea in that region became unnavigable, choked with mud raised from the ocean floor. Ships that attempted to sail through these waters became stuck in what seemed like liquid earth, and sailors reported that this area remained impassable for many generations. This ancient tale might well have faded into oblivion, like countless other legends of divine wrath and human short-sightedness. Yet something special about the story of Atlantis has invariably captivated minds, surpassing in impact even the most detailed and accurate historical chronicles of fallen cities. Perhaps it was the very notion that such an advanced civilization could vanish without a trace, as if dissolving into nothingness in a single night. Or, perhaps, the enduring appeal lay in the tantalizing prospect of discovery. Somewhere deep beneath the ocean waves, perhaps the magnificent ruins of this once brilliant city still lie, patiently awaiting their moment to be rediscovered. Centuries passed, and tireless explorers, adventurous treasure hunters, and indefatigable dreamers continued their search for Atlantis, ranging from the boundless expanses of the Mediterranean to the vast Atlantic, from the azure waters of the Caribbean to the icy shores of Antarctica. Some enthusiasts claim to have found compelling evidence of its existence in mysterious underwater formations off the coast of Bimini. Others hypothesized that Atlantis might have been merely an echo of memories of the powerful Minoan culture, which was ruthlessly wiped off the face of the earth by a destructive volcanic eruption and subsequent tsunami. However, perhaps the true geographical location of this mythical continent is not so important. Perhaps Atlantis exists not as a specific place that can be found with modern ships and complex diving equipment, but rather as a profound and enduring idea that is reborn again and again in the collective consciousness of humanity. This idea embodies the concept of an ideal society that, having reached the peak of its development, ultimately destroyed itself under the weight of its own success. It is the image of a civilization that ascended to such dizzying heights that in the process it forgot the fundamental values that originally served as the foundation for its greatness. Whenever any society becomes overly arrogant, excessively convinced of its undeniable superiority, and too ready to impose its will on other peoples through brute force, the invisible spectre of Atlantis begins to whisper its eternal warning. Whenever humanity witnesses the rapid development of technology and unprecedented prosperity, yet devoid of wisdom and reasonable restraint, it sees before it the very conditions that are believed to have led to the tragic demise of the most advanced civilization ever to exist on Earth. Perhaps it is for this profound reason that people tirelessly continue their search for Atlantis. They search for it not only in the unexplored depths of the world's oceans, but also in the continuous succession of rises and falls of civilizations throughout documented history. We continue to search for it because, in essence, we ourselves continue to recreate its conditions, and we constantly need this powerful reminder that the true price of greatness lies in humility, in the ability to always remember our origin, and the genuine motivations that prompted us to embark on this grand path of development. The path to restoring lost greatness often requires not so much profound wisdom as considerable courage. This truth was to be learned by a young prince named Jason when he dared to embark on a quest for a treasure that seemed utterly unattainable. His epic journey was to take him to the very edges of the then-known world, and on this perilous voyage he was accompanied by heroes whose names still echo in the majestic corridors of ancient legends. Like many tales of antiquity, Jason's story begins with family betrayal. His cunning uncle Peleus treacherously usurped the throne that rightfully belonged to Jason's father, and when the prince reached maturity, he returned to demand the return of his rightful inheritance. However, Peleus, distinguished by his extraordinary cunning and undisguised cruelty, made Jason an offer that at first glance seemed quite generous, but was in fact cunningly designed to get rid of the young prince forever. "I will gladly yield the throne to you," Peleus said with a smile that, however, did not reach his cold eyes. "But first you must prove your true worth by performing a great and unparalleled deed. Bring me the golden fleece from distant Colchis, and then the kingdom will rightfully be yours." The golden fleece in question belonged to a magical ram that had once saved 2 children, carrying them on its back, soaring through the air with the same ease as the swiftest bird. When this sacred ram was sacrificed to the gods, its fleece, shining like the sun itself, was solemnly hung in a sacred grove in the remote kingdom of Colchis, located on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. However, the fleece did not simply rest there, waiting to be plucked like ripe fruit from a tree branch. It was tirelessly guarded by a dragon that never knew sleep, never closed its eyes, and never for a single moment relaxed its vigilance. This was not the type of dragon one usually finds in children's stories, huge, fire-breathing, and dramatic in its threat. This dragon was far more terrifying precisely because it was patient, extraordinarily intelligent, and absolutely devoted to its single task. The dragon coiled around a mighty oak, on whose branches the fleece hung, its scales constantly changing hue with the play of light, sometimes gleaming gold, like the fleece itself, and sometimes turning dark, like the deep shadows lurking between the leaves. Its eyes, like polished amber, watched every minute movement in the sacred grove with the same focused and tireless attention as a predator with all the time in the world. To reach Colchis, Jason needed not just a ship, but a crew with enough courage to venture into uncharted waters, teeming with monsters, hostile tribes, and navigational hazards that had previously doomed countless vessels. Thus he gave orders for the construction of a ship named the Argo, and summoned heroes from all corners of the land to join him in this enterprise, which, as everyone well understood, would most likely be a one-way journey. The response to his call was truly astonishing. Heroes from all over Greece flocked to join those who would later be known as the Argonauts. Among them was Heracles, the mightiest of all mortals, capable of single-handedly battling lions and altering the courses of rivers. Orpheus was present, whose enchanting music had the power to tame wild beasts and even make stones weep. Nearby were the twins Castor and Pollux, masters of horsemanship and boxing, as well as Atalanta, an unmatched huntress, capable of outrunning any man, whose pay. Arrows never missed their mark. Each of these valiant heroes had their own, sometimes deeply personal, reasons for participating in this grand expedition. Some yearned for immortal glory, others for thrilling adventures. Some sought to escape difficult circumstances in their homeland, while others pursued dreams they could not yet fully articulate. But all of them clearly understood that this journey would subject them to trials they had never before experienced. The arduous journey to Colchis lasted many months, and each part of it was a stand-alone, perilous adventure. The Argonauts had to pass through the Symplegades, massive, moving rocks that periodically clashed together, mercilessly crushing any vessel caught between them. They encountered harpies, malicious creatures with the bodies of birds and the faces of women, who tormented a wise old king by constantly snatching his food. They landed on islands where the locals had never before seen foreigners, and they had to resort to diplomacy as often as to force to continue their journey. Sometimes the local inhabitants met them with hostility, other times they offered assistance, but invariably they were overcome by a deep curiosity towards these extraordinary heroes who had ventured so far from home, pursuing such a dangerous and ambitious mission. When the Argo finally dropped anchor in Colchis, King Aeetes received Jason and his valiant crew with the suspicious hospitality that rulers usually reserve for visitors who could be both valuable allies and serious threats. The king agreed to give Jason the Golden Fleece, but only on the condition that he could complete a series of tasks that at first glance seemed utterly impossible. First, Jason had to yoke 2 colossal bronze bulls that breathed fire and had hooves of copper. Then, using these furious animals, he had to plough a field and sow it with dragon's teeth. From these teeth, fully armed warriors were to grow, whom Jason was obliged to defeat before sunset. This was a trial originally designed for his inevitable demise, and everyone present understood this perfectly. Before this, the bronze bulls had mercilessly trampled and burned all previous contenders who dared to challenge them. The warriors growing from the dragon's teeth were incredibly fierce, impeccably coordinated, and utterly merciless. No mortal man, it was expected, could survive such trials. However, Jason found a completely unexpected ally, Medea, the king's own daughter, who was extraordinarily skilled in magic and herbal lore. She had observed Jason from the moment of his arrival in Colchis, and something in his fearlessness and obvious devotion to his goal deeply touched her heart. Medea was no ordinary princess, passively awaiting rescue. She possessed a keen mind, immense magical power, and deep knowledge of entities and energies most people feared even to contemplate. Her magic could both heal and harm, protect and destroy, and she made a firm decision to use these abilities to help the foreign prince who had travelled so far to accomplish a deed everyone deemed impossible. She gave Jason a magical ointment that would protect him from the bulls' scorching fiery breath and their deadly bronze hooves. She also revealed to him the secret of defeating the warriors growing from the dragon's teeth, to throw a stone into their midst so that, blinded by rage, they would begin to fight each other instead of him. And most importantly, she promised to help him pass the sleepless dragon that tirelessly guarded the Golden Fleece itself. The trials unfolded exactly as Medea had predicted. Protected by her miraculous ointment, Jason managed to yoke the fierce bronze bulls and plough the field. When armed warriors sprang from the freshly ploughed furrows, he hurled a stone into their midst, and they immediately began to fight each other with such unrestrained fury that they completely annihilated themselves. King Aeetes was consumed by uncontrollable rage that Jason had succeeded. However, he could not openly renege on his public promise. Nevertheless, he had no intention of actually giving up the Golden Fleece. Instead, he began to secretly plan a surprise night attack on the Argonauts, intending to kill them all while they slept peacefully. Medea, who understood her father's treacherous schemes better than anyone, immediately warned Jason of the impending betrayal. That same night, she led him to the sacred grove where the Golden Fleece shone on the mighty oak, guarded by the dragon that was known never to sleep. The dragon sensed their approach long before they reached the tree itself. Its enormous head slowly rose from the dense coils of its body, and its amber eyes stared at them with an expression of malevolent intelligence. It made no sound. It did not roar or hiss like lesser creatures. Its true threat lay in its absolute stillness, in its patient and tireless readiness to strike a deadly blow. Medea began to sing, a song in a language that was probably older than Greek, perhaps even older than any human language. It was a lullaby addressing the deepest, most primitive parts of the brain, those corners that held memories of what it was like to be small and protected, cradled in loving arms. The dragon's head began to sway almost imperceptibly, as if it were struggling with something entirely new, something it had never encountered before. Its amber eyes, which had never closed, began to grow heavy. The coils of its enormous body loosened, as muscles that had been tense for decades finally began to relax. For the first time in its long and sleepless existence, the sleepless dragon fell into slumber. Jason climbed the oak as silently as possible, barely daring to breathe as he reached for the Golden Fleece. When his fingers touched it, the fleece felt warm, as if it still held the life of the magical ram from which it originated. It was surprisingly light and seemed to emit its own inner radiance. With the fleece securely tucked under his arm, Jason descended from the oak and followed Medea out of the sacred grove. Behind them, the dragon slept, immersed in dreams that no creature before it had ever experienced, for this was its first such oblivion. The journey home proved no less perilous than the path to Colchis, and now it was further complicated by the fact that King Aeetes had sent his ships in pursuit to reclaim his daughter and destroy the thieves of his treasure. But that is an entirely different story, full of its own adventures and heartaches. What is truly important at this moment is that Jason accomplished a deed that was universally believed to be utterly impossible. He obtained the Golden Fleece, a treasure guarded by a creature that never rested, never relaxed its vigilance, and never gave anyone the slightest chance to approach. Sometimes the most formidable guardian can be overcome not by brute force or sophisticated cunning, but by offering them something they have never had, in this case the simple and priceless gift of sleep. This rest, which every living creature needs, was denied to the dragon by the very nature of its duty. This circumstance leads to deep reflection on what other seemingly impossible tasks might actually be accomplished, and not by fighting harder or being more cunning, but through a profound understanding of the guardian's true needs and finding a way to satisfy those needs. The deep understanding of the motives that drive one to undertake seemingly impossible feats was fully present in Heracles, perhaps more so than in any other mortal. However, this wisdom came to him through a series of trials that nearly crushed his spirit and body. The legend of his life serves as an eternal reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts and the most profound weaknesses of human nature spring from a single root, and the path to true redemption invariably demands sacrifices from an individual that exceed all conceivable limits of endurance. Heracles was born endowed with strength that far surpassed human capabilities. Even as an infant, he effortlessly strangled 2 venomous snakes sent to destroy him, and astonishingly, he did so with a carefree laugh, as if it were merely a child's game. With each passing year, his physical might only multiplied, reaching a level where he could easily lift enormous boulders that would require a dozen strong men to move, grapple with lions without any weapon, and bend iron bars with the same ease with which an ordinary person bends a thin flower stem. However, along with this colossal physical gift, a temperament grew within him that was no less powerful than his muscles but far more insidious and dangerous. When rage consumed Heracles, it did not manifest in ordinary human expressions. Like raising his voice or hastily leaving a room, his fury was akin to a natural disaster, sudden, all-consuming, and infinitely destructive. For many years, Heracles managed to restrain and control this dark side of his nature. He married the beautiful Megara, and their union was blessed with children. It seemed that he had finally found the peaceful domestic happiness that might tame the wild temperament hidden in his heart. Heracles proved to be a caring parent, surprisingly gentle with his offspring despite his colossal might, and a faithful husband, striving daily to live up to the trust of his loved ones. However, the goddess Hera, whose hatred for Heracles had burned since his birth because he was the illegitimate son of her husband Zeus, plotted to destroy this fragile happiness in the most sophisticated and cruel way. She inflicted upon the hero a fit of furious madness, an all-consuming rage that completely deprived him of the ability to perceive himself and his actions. When the veil of madness finally lifted from his mind, Heracles found himself surrounded by an unbearable horror that was destined to be his eternal companion for the rest of his days. In a fit of uncontrolled fury, he had personally taken the lives of his beloved wife and children, the very people he cherished most in the world. His colossal strength, meant to protect them, had become a monstrous instrument of their demise. The subsequent grief and unbearable guilt were so overwhelming that they nearly destroyed him entirely. For several days he remained in a stupor amidst the wreckage of his former happiness, unable to eat, sleep, or even utter a word. How could one continue to live with the knowledge that you yourself had destroyed everything you ever valued? How was it possible to breathe when the most hidden fears about your own nature had turned into a terrifying reality? Finally, in deep despair, seeking some path to atone for his monstrous deed, Heracles journeyed to Delphi to consult the oracle. The prophecy received from the priestess was harsh and merciless, yet in it glimmered a thin thread of hope. Heracles was to serve his cousin, King Eurystheus, known for his cowardice, for 12 years and carry out any tasks the king deemed fit to assign. Only upon completion of this arduous service could he hope for purification from his horrifying crime. King Eurystheus, who by fate had been granted authority over such a great hero as Heracles, embodied the petty, envious, and ruthless man one might expect in such a situation. Despite his baseness, he was cunning enough to realize that Heracles' colossal power posed a threat to him, and cowardly enough to seek to destroy that power rather than use it for good. That is why Eurystheus devised and proposed to Heracles a series of 12 labors. Each of these tasks was originally conceived as impossible, and each aimed to lead the hero to a most agonizing and terrible death. If, by some incredible means, the hero managed to cope with one trial, the next invariably proved even more deadly and cunning. The first of these trials involved slaying the Nemean lion, a monstrous predator whose hide was so impenetrable that no known weapon could harm it. Arrows bounced off its thick fur like pebbles, swords broke upon contact, and spears shattered upon impact. Ultimately, Heracles had to resort to his incredible physical strength to strangle the beast with his bare hands. This exhausting struggle lasted an entire day, leaving the hero depleted but ultimately victorious. The second labor was to destroy the Lernaean Hydra, a multi-headed serpent-like monster whose heads grew back twice as numerous each time one was severed. With each swing of Heracles' sword, instead of one severed head, 2 new ones grew, and soon he faced a writhing mass of snapping jaws and deadly, venomous fangs. The hero found a solution to this complex problem by instructing his nephews to immediately cauterize each neck stump with torches after he severed a head, thereby preventing its regrowth. This episode was one of the few times Heracles accepted outside help during his trials, and it taught him a valuable lesson. Brute force alone is sometimes not enough. Wisdom and the ability to work together are also necessary. The third trial led him to the mountainous regions, where he was to capture the Ceryneian hind, a sacred animal of the goddess Artemis, distinguished by its golden antlers. This task required not so much physical strength as exceptional patience and perseverance, for Heracles had to pursue this incredibly swift creature for a whole year before he could finally capture it without causing the slightest harm, which made the task many times more difficult. Each subsequent labor presented him with new challenges, carefully testing different facets of Heracles' character. He had to capture the enormous Erymanthian boar alive, clean the Augean stables which housed thousands of cattle and had never been cleaned, drive away the Stymphalian man-eating birds, tame the fire-breathing mares of Diomedes, obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Some of these tasks required him to develop diplomatic skills he previously lacked. Others demanded cunning and strategic planning, rather than simply applying brute force. Thus, the hero who had previously relied solely on his physical might gradually learned the art of using his mind, his heart, and his ability to interact with others. However, the most grandiose and difficult trials still awaited the hero. The 10th task was to steal the cattle of Geryon, a 3-bodied giant whose domain was located at the westernmost edge of the known world. To reach Geryon's island, Heracles had to undertake a long journey across vast ocean expanses, and along the way he erected the Pillars of Heracles, now called the Strait of Gibraltar, as an eternal marker signifying the furthest known point of the world. The 11th labor sent him to the mysterious Garden of the Hesperides, where golden apples with miraculous properties grew. These fruits bestowed immortality upon anyone who tasted them, and they were vigilantly guarded not only by the Hesperides themselves, nymphs who sang while tending the trees, but also by the 100-headed dragon Ladon. To complete this task, Heracles had to resort to cunning and persuade the mighty Titan Atlas to assist him. Atlas, condemned to forever hold up the celestial vault as punishment for his role in an ancient rebellion against the Olympian gods, agreed to fetch the apples if Heracles temporarily took on his colossal burden. Thus, for a brief moment, Heracles found himself at the edge of the world, bearing the entire weight of the heavens on his shoulders, comprehending the true meaning of inescapable responsibility. The 12th, final labour seemed absolutely impossible: to descend into the depths of the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of the realm of the dead. No living mortal had ever before managed to penetrate Hades' kingdom and return, and Cerberus himself had never been subdued by any hero or monster. However, by this point, Heracles had undergone profound changes, becoming a completely different man from the one who, full of unrestrained rage, had begun these labours 12 years prior. He had acquired patience while pursuing the golden fetter, mastered the basics of diplomacy during his encounters with the Amazons, and learned true humility when the entire weight of the celestial vault rested on his shoulders. When he appeared before the lords of the underworld, Hades and Persephone, to request permission to attempt to capture Cerberus, he did so with the deepest respect, without a trace of his former arrogance. Hades agreed to give him this opportunity, but with one indispensable condition. Heracles had to subdue Cerberus using only his own strength, without any weapons and without anyone's assistance. This was the culminating test of all the lessons he had learned during his years of forced service. The struggle between Heracles and Cerberus was truly epic, yet surprisingly silent. There was no deafening roar, no theatrical poses, only a calm, patient confrontation of strength against strength, endurance against endurance. Heracles gripped the powerful neck of the enormous dog tightly and did not let go, no matter how fiercely the creature thrashed and desperately tried to shake him off. Eventually, Cerberus seemed to realize that this man would not let go, would not retreat, would not be intimidated, and would not be broken. And with an expression that could be interpreted as a peculiar respect, the guardian of the underworld allowed himself to be led into the world of the living. When Heracles appeared before King Eurystheus, presenting him with the 3-headed monster, the cowardly ruler, overcome with terror at the mere sight, immediately granted Heracles his long-awaited freedom. The 12 labours were successfully completed, the debt of atonement was fully paid, and the hero finally gained the right to live his own life. However, the essence of tasks that fundamentally change human nature is this: having completed them, the individual is never the same as they were at the beginning of the journey. Heracles, having successfully completed the 12 labours, was a completely different man than the one who, filled with grief and guilt, began them 12 years prior. He understood that true power does not come from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when to refrain from using one's strength. The hero realized that the fiercest battles are often fought not against external monsters, but against those aspects of one's own personality that cause the most aversion, and he discovered that redemption is not a final goal to strive for, but rather a way of life, a daily choice to use one's unique gifts for something much greater than oneself. The legend of the 12 labors of Heracles serves as an eternal reminder that sometimes the very trials that seem designed to destroy us are actually the greatest teachers, revealing to us our true essence and the potential of who we are capable of becoming. The question of the limits of human potential and audacity was, Sisyphus believed, resolved once and for all. He was convinced that he possessed enough intelligence and cunning to outwit anyone, including the Olympian gods themselves. His story serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us that there are contests where victory brings no desired outcome and triumphs that turn into genuine catastrophes. Sisyphus was the ruler of prosperous Corinth, renowned throughout Greece for his extraordinary shrewdness and devious mind. He built and transformed his domain into a flourishing kingdom, relying on a combination of deep strategic thinking and relentless pragmatism. He was the kind of ruler who always seemed to be several steps ahead of his opponents, capable of finding a loophole or an advantage in any situation. However, he also had a fatal flaw. Sisyphus could not resist boastfully flaunting his cleverness, even when it would have been wiser to remain silent and keep his schemes secret. He was like a masterful chess player who couldn't help but analyze every brilliant move for his opponents, even if it revealed his tactical plans. His troubles began when Sisyphus became an unwitting witness to something that should have remained hidden. Zeus himself, the supreme lord of Olympus, had transformed into a mighty eagle to abduct a beautiful river nymph named Aegina. Her grieving father, the powerful river god Asopus, tirelessly searched for his missing daughter and approached Sisyphus for assistance. The prudent decision for Sisyphus would have been to feign ignorance. After all, what mortal ruler would dare to meddle in a dispute between gods? But Sisyphus saw a unique opportunity to gain the support of an influential ally and could not resist the temptation to demonstrate the depth of his knowledge. "I know what happened to your daughter," Sisyphus told Asopus. "Zeus carried her away, but if you desire this information, I demand something in return. Grant my city an inexhaustible source of pure fresh water, and then I will reveal her whereabouts." This seemed like a brilliant deal. Asopus, fulfilling his promise, granted Corinth a spring. Sisyphus, in turn, exposed Zeus's transgression, and Corinth gained a priceless water resource. However, Sisyphus made a fatal error, carelessly attempting to manipulate forces immeasurably superior to his own, naively believing he could escape retribution. The supreme god Zeus, upon learning of the betrayal, was extremely angered that a mortal king had not only revealed his secret, but also set an enraged river god upon him. He decreed that Sisyphus needed to be taught a harsh lesson, demonstrating the harmfulness of excessive cunning turned against one's own well-being. Zeus sent Thanatos herself, the personification of death, to take Sisyphus and escort him to the gloomy halls of Hades. But even in the face of the inevitable fate awaiting every mortal, Sisyphus could not resist the temptation to outwit his adversary once more. When death arrived at the palace in Corinth, Sisyphus met her with feigned submission and humility. "I suppose my hour has come," he said with feigned sadness. "I am ready to follow you. But tell me, O Death, about these chains you hold. How do they work? I have heard of their unbreakable nature, but have never seen them so closely." Death, proud of her unbreakable shackles, eagerly began to demonstrate. "You see, once these chains snap shut, no force in the entire universe can break them. Allow me to show you how they close." And before Thanatos could realize what was happening, Sisyphus deftly shackled Death herself in her own unbreakable chains. With death imprisoned in her own bonds, no one on earth could die any more. This was a flagrant violation of the fundamental order of the cosmos. At first, Sisyphus rejoiced in his unprecedented trick. He had managed to deceive Death herself. He had accomplished a feat unthinkable for any other mortal. However, gradually the devastating consequences of his actions became apparent. Without Thanatos to take the old and infirm, the world plunged into an abyss of unbearable suffering. People who should have found peace in the embrace of death were doomed to drag out miserable existences in pain and infirmity. Warriors mortally wounded on battlefields could not die, so they remained lying on the ground with horrific wounds, unable to heal or find release through death. The Olympians were not just indignant, they were deeply disturbed. The entire cosmic balance depended on the unbroken cycle of life and death. Without Thanatos to maintain the balance of life, the very existence of the universe was threatened with complete collapse. Finally, Ares, the formidable god of war, appeared in Corinth to put an end to this chaos. He freed Death from her chains and personally escorted Sisyphus to the realm of the dead. But even then, Sisyphus had another cunning plan. Before going to the underworld, Sisyphus instructed his wife not to perform the customary funeral rites for him. When he reached the gates of the underworld, he immediately expressed his indignation to Hades about this blatant violation of sacred laws. "My wife has disgraced me by depriving me of a proper farewell," Sisyphus indignantly said. "She did not grant me proper funeral rites. Can you truly demand that I remain in the underworld, if I was not sent here according to ancient traditions?" Hades, who strictly observed established orders and rituals, acknowledged the validity of Sisyphus's claims and granted Sisyphus permission to return to the world of the living, but only temporarily, so that he could arrange his proper funeral. However, once in Corinth, Sisyphus had no intention of voluntarily returning to the realm of the dead. He lived. For many more years, enjoying earthly pleasures and boastfully bragging about how he had tricked death, not once, but twice. Eventually, of course, inexorable old age finally caught up with him, and when he died a natural death, escaping his final fate became impossible. But by that time the gods had decreed that ordinary punishment would be insufficient for someone who had caused so much trouble and shown such flagrant disregard for the natural order of the cosmos. Sisyphus was condemned to a unique form of eternal retribution. He was assigned an eternal task, to tirelessly push a huge boulder to the top of a steep hill. However, the cunning twist was that each time he almost reached the summit, the stone would roll back down, forcing him to begin his endless toil anew. Imagine the scene. Sisyphus, straining with all his might, presses his shoulder against the enormous stone, feeling its colossal weight and rough surface, beginning his agonizing, slow ascent up the mountainside. Every muscle in his body hardens like steel. His breath becomes ragged and heavy. Salty sweat streams down his face, blurring his vision. Step by step, overcoming every inch of the slope, he pushes the boulder higher and higher up the mountainside. As he ascends, he sees the coveted hilltop slowly but surely approaching. A fragile hope blossoms in his tormented heart that this time things will be different, that this time he will truly manage to roll the stone to the very top. He pushes with redoubled effort, overcoming the burning pain that pierces his back and shoulders, concentrating all his remaining energy on the last, seemingly decisive meters. And then, at the very moment when triumph seems imminent, The boulder slips from his weakening hands and crashes back down to the foot of the mountain. Sisyphus can only watch helplessly as all his achievements vanish in an instant. He is forced to accept that all his titanic efforts were in vain, and to begin this endless process all over again from the very beginning. This punishment was conceived with diabolical sophistication, perfectly matching the deep essence of Sisyphus's character. He always sought victory, driven by an insatiable desire to outwit everyone, to accomplish what was inaccessible to others. Now he was trapped in a task where victory was fundamentally unattainable, where all his cunning proved absolutely useless, where his sharp mind gave him no advantage whatsoever. However, it is here that the narrative takes an unexpected, profound turn. After countless ages of laboriously pushing his boulder, something subtle yet fundamental changed within Sisyphus himself. He began to discover a peculiar tranquility in the monotonous repetition, a rhythm that acquired an almost meditative quality. He started to notice details that he had previously, in his bustling life, paid no attention to. How the light played on the mountainside throughout the day, the tiny wild flowers pushing through cracks in the stones, the sensation of his own muscles working in concert to move this massive stone. He began to take pride not in reaching the summit, which he knew was impossible, but in the quality of his effort, the unyielding resilience of his will and determination. Some sages and philosophers suggest that in his eternal, seemingly meaningless task, Sisyphus grasped a truth that had remained inaccessible to him throughout his life full of intrigues and cunning. Satisfaction is found not in deceiving others or in illusory victories over impossibility, but in simply, honestly performing one's work with dignity and unwavering perseverance, regardless of the final outcome. Perhaps the true punishment was not the endless labor itself, but the sudden realization of how different his life could have been if he had earlier learned to find deep meaning in the process itself, rather than focusing exclusively on achieving the result. Or perhaps this curse gradually transformed into a kind of blessing, a chance to discover that even in the most hopeless and meaningless circumstances, one can find purpose and even achieve satisfaction. The myth of Sisyphus serves as a powerful reminder for each of us that sometimes the very qualities we mistakenly consider signs of our superiority, our evasiveness, our ability to find loopholes and detours, our unwavering determination to win at all costs, can become the sources of our deepest sufferings. And sometimes it is precisely those tasks that seem most meaningless and futile that teach us the most important lessons about what is truly valuable. Each of us has our own boulders to push, our own hills to climb, our own tasks that seem to renew themselves just as we begin to believe we have made some progress. The question is not whether we will succeed in the way we initially imagined, but whether we will find the strength to push our stone with dignity, with a clear purpose, and perhaps even with an inner joy. Finding joy even amidst the most impossible circumstances was an art that Daedalus mastered more deeply than many others. However, his own narrative reveals a truth to us, that sometimes the very solutions we so diligently craft to overcome our difficulties can become the source of a far deeper and more agonizing tragedy. His fate is an epic saga of great genius and boundless love, of astonishing innovations and bitter losses, and of the unbearable weight of unforeseen, sometimes catastrophic, consequences. Daedalus was, without a doubt, the greatest inventor and most skilled craftsman ever to walk the earth, His clever hands could shape any material into any form his imagination could conjure, and his fancy seemed to know no bounds. He created mechanical servants capable of performing complex tasks, fountains that emitted melodic sounds as water flowed through them, and sculptures so lifelike that people would instinctively speak to them, expecting a reply. His workshop was a true marvel, filled with unfinished projects and ingenious innovations. Gears and pulleys hung from the ceiling, alongside meticulously detailed sketches of flying machines. Workbenches were cluttered with models of buildings, daringly defying traditional architectural canons. Devices capable of measuring the passage of time or predicting the whims of the weather, and toys that moved on their own, as if alive. However, Daedalus's greatest creation was not an ingenious device or a magnificent structure. It was his own son, Icarus. Not literally created, of course, but shaped and nurtured by years of patient teaching and gentle, wise guidance. Icarus inherited his father's inquisitive curiosity and sharp mind, though he certainly lacked the patience and worldly wisdom that came with age to the elder. One can easily imagine them toiling together in the workshop. Daedalus taught his son how to join pieces of wood so they would remain inseparable, how to temper metal, to perfect sharpness, how to observe the flight of birds and understand the principles that kept them aloft. Icarus listened with boundless attention, his young face serious with deep concentration, asking endless questions about why things worked in one way and not another. However, their peaceful existence was suddenly disrupted when King Minos of Crete summoned Daedalus to his court. The ruler of Crete had a serious problem. His wife had given birth to a horrifying monster named the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, and he needed a secure place to keep it imprisoned. Not to kill it, mind you, but to confine it in such a way that the monster could not terrorize his subjects, yet continued to live. Daedalus, using all his genius, designed and built the labyrinth, a maze so complex and intricate that anyone who dared to enter it inevitably lost all hope of escape. Its passages twisted and turned, doubling back, ending in dead ends, opening into chambers that seemed to promise an exit, but in reality led only deeper into the heart of the convoluted structure. In its very center, the Minotaur resided in a kind of peaceful captivity, fed and cared for, but utterly incapable of finding its way out. The labyrinth became a true masterpiece of engineering and a deep understanding of human psychology, taking into account not only the physical difficulties of navigation, but also the psychological impact of prolonged confusion and disorientation. It was designed not merely as an impregnable prison, but as a tool intended to make anyone trapped inside gradually lose all hope of regaining freedom. For several years, Daedalus and his son Icarus lived peacefully on Crete. Respected figures at King Minos's court, Daedalus tirelessly continued his work, bringing innovative ideas to life and finding elegant solutions to the intricate problems facing the royal court. Icarus, meanwhile, grew from a boy into a flourishing youth, learning his father's craft and discovering his own talents and passions. However, then an event occurred that overturned their accustomed way of life. The hero Theseus arrived on Crete and, with the help of the king's daughter Ariadne, managed to navigate the complexities of the labyrinth, defeat the terrible Minotaur, and escape the island's shores. King Minos was consumed by uncontrollable rage, not only because of the loss of the Minotaur, but also from the bitter realization that his seemingly impregnable prison had been conquered. In his boundless fury, Minos blamed Daedalus for the labyrinth's defeat. For how else could Theseus have succeeded unless the labyrinth's creator himself had somehow revealed its hidden secrets? This accusation was entirely baseless. Daedalus had nothing whatsoever to do with Theseus's triumph, but justice was not among King Minos's priorities when he was consumed by rage. In retaliation for the supposed betrayal, Minos imprisoned Daedalus and Icarus in a dungeon, a tall tower located on a tiny island off the coast of Crete. The tower was lofty and isolated, surrounded by sea waves on all sides, with no vessel within reach and no hope of swimming to the saving shore. The ruler comforted himself with the thought that even the ingenious creator Daedalus would not be able to escape from such an impregnable prison. For several weeks, father and son lived in their tower cell, content with the meager meal delivered once a day, watching the change of day and night through a single window, and agonizing over whether they were destined to spend the rest of their days in captivity. Daedalus spent his time meticulously studying the feathered inhabitants nesting in the tower walls, observing how they used their wings to glide on invisible air currents, and how they could soar for hours without tiring. Icarus, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless in captivity. He was young, full of vitality and energy, accustomed to a dynamic life, active participation in creative projects, and the acquisition of new knowledge. Forced idleness proved almost more burdensome for him than the imprisonment itself. He restlessly paced the cramped cell, stared out the window for hours, and incessantly bombarded his father with questions about when they would be freed and how they would manage to escape. It was on one of these endless, tranquil days that an epiphany struck Daedalus. His gaze was drawn to the flight of a seagull, gliding past their window, its wings barely stirring as it ascended on a warm updraft from the rocks below. Suddenly, a simple truth illuminated his mind. "We may not be able to leave these walls on foot," he told Icarus, "and we may not be able to leave by water, but there remains only one path that Minos did not think to block, the boundless sky." Using the meager materials found in their cell and in the tower around them, Daedalus set about creating 2 pairs of wings. He carefully gathered feathers shed by the feathered inhabitants nesting in the walls, starting with the softest downy plumes and progressing to the powerful, long flight feathers that provided lift and control. The construction was an arduous and delicate process that consumed all his skill and considerable patience. Each feather had to be perfectly fitted, secured with threads salvaged from their worn clothing, and wax melted from the meager candles that lit their cell. The wings had to be light enough to allow flight, yet strong enough to support human weight, flexible enough to respond to the slightest changes in air currents, yet rigid enough to provide stable lift. Icarus helped with the construction, but it was clear that his ardent heart was not entirely devoted to this cautious, meticulous work. He was impatient to try out these wings, to test their functionality, to taste the intoxicating freedom of flight. While his father meticulously checked every fastening and tested every knot, Icarus dreamed of soaring high above the island, feeling the gusts of wind beneath artificial wings and experiencing the jubilant ecstasy of an aerial escape from their captivity. When the painstaking work was finally completed and the wings were ready, Daedalus spent an entire day teaching his son the art of using them. They practiced the movements on the floor of their cramped cell, learning how to create the necessary lift by flapping their arms, how to shift their body weight for maneuvering, and how to recognize the invisible signs indicating air currents. "Remember, my child," Daedalus emphatically repeated. "Keep to a moderate height. Do not descend too low, for otherwise the sea foam will dampen your fragile wings and make them impossibly heavy.